And here we are, episode 6. Howdy, Gene.
Hey, what's up, Steve?
Oh, it's crazy times in the tech world. So we're gonna change the show up a little bit. We're gonna do the loving and hating software up top, and then we're gonna really dig into what's happening in startup land, particularly New York-based startups. There's a lot of changes, people coming, going, mergers, sales. Some of it has historic kind of consequences, and some of it's just expected noise. But let's start with loving and hating, because let's start with the one you love at the top.
The one I love at the top. Okay, I sent it to you, so I love so many things. Remind me again what it is. It was my
the
choice.
Silent Age.
Oh, it's awesome. Okay. And I have a mixed feeling ultimately, but so Silent Age is, anyone who's been around for a while or has even read a little, the whole history of what we would call interactive storytelling used to just be this very kind of branch tree thing. You decide whether the code is red or green, and it's a fictional video, but then movies have tried to do this even and dabbled in it. And then there's video games and all the stuff we're starting to do with VR and AR. Silent Age is one of a breed. They all seem to have slick but simplistic animation, and this one it's a little bit somewhere between an espionage novel, a psychological thriller, and one of these escape rooms where you as a user are following a character. In this case, this guy who's a janitor but is intertwined in international espionage, the Vietnam War, and a murder mystery set in 3 different stages of the past, present, and future. And it's just, it's kind of beautiful in how it's presented, and it's interesting, and it's a way that you quickly kill a half hour, 45 minutes, and then you kind of don't know what you do after that. So I've probably said too much, but have you dabbled in any of these? There's a bunch of iPhone and Android apps.
I have not, and you're more the gamer dude than I am. But
yeah, right.
we did pull up this image of the flag with someone that looks vaguely like Richard Nixon sitting at a desk.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't tell us the story. We have to play it ourselves. Is that it?
Well, I don't want to dwell too much on it, and there is somewhat of a mystery in what happens. But this guy who's a janitor is suddenly sees some murder happen that may or may not have to do with this bizarre pharma energy company he works for that's causing environmental nightmares. And somehow, as a user, you're able to help him open doors and investigate and jump to the future or past. And so that's kind of the way it works, and it's a bunch of decisions, and you don't get to go to the next step until you find out who the grizzled old man was, who you suspect may actually be you.
And as with all things we show on the podcast, this will be in the discussion section, so you'll have the link. You can try it out. Now,
I'm glad I gave you that one just because it's free until you reach a certain part, so you can download it easily and just give it a try and put your headphones on, which it instructs you to do.
So in the spirit of the holidays, we're not going to do a hating this week. We're going to do a second positive one, right?
Yes, and I'm adjusting this to endorsing.
All right. So what are we endorsing this week?
Yeah. So it's Hour of Code, who some of you out there may be very familiar with, may have just it clips the news every once in a while. It tends to be 1 or sometimes 2 hours that's been set up kind of internationally, anchored around schools, communities, and tech companies. In my neighborhood in Westchester, IBM is very involved. And so it's meant for you to go into the school and have a couple hundred or a couple thousand people just code for an hour, no matter who they are or what their level is. And it's actually, in some ways, better for a beginner to finally be pushed into the option of 3 different, this only takes 1 hour beginner courses that you've always said you couldn't do or you never would want to learn anyway. It's like learning chess. But it's fun. So I went with my son for the second time this year, Friday night, and it's just a wonderful thing. It's a little bit of a propaganda event, has a million flaws, but it should be better attended and better known about, and it's one of these keys to unlocking the future. So I just applaud its effort, even though so much more could be done.
All right, so Hour of Code for sure,
Yep.
and what's the silent one called?
It's called The Silent Age, and there's like a category of these things. Once you go on, they're just kind of immersive video game kinds of narratives. Anyway, look up The Silent Age.
All right. So on the show today, I just started to see this theme, and I'll just rattle off the companies, and then we'll go through them. I think they'll all end up getting knit together. But changes at Etsy, WeWork buying Meetup, Tumblr's CEO stepping down, and changes at Kickstarter all felt to me like the end of an era. In some cases, the beginning of a new one, and in some cases not. So let's just start right at the top. Let's start with Etsy. There was a great big New York Times piece about it and about what's going on at Etsy, and everyone painted a pretty big smiley face on it, but I wasn't sure that wasn't necessarily what I got out of it.
Well, I think this is inevitable. And with a very creative company, the context that's important to know is Etsy is one of these standard bearers of maybe what we would call Web 2.0, rose up in the mid, 2000s and has been a force. But ironically, like Kickstarter and Meetup, had a benevolent, handmade feel to it in a way that is not necessarily aligned with the ferocious 7-year, fuses of VCs, or in the case of Etsy, importantly, an IPO, which really pushes you into the mode where it's grow and expand margins, or else what are you doing here? And so I think that they have been such a juggernaut. I believe that Etsy is amazing still because it has an opportunity to expand in many different ways while also doing well and being profitable. So I don't think it should be a problem that they're facing kind of a crossroads. But this management shift about 6-9 months ago, whenever that was, to kind of reorient without losing the company is what's key. But you're right. It's like adolescence, everything now changes for some of these companies.
So the thing I guess I didn't get with Etsy was they had kind of a wild, kooky, complex founder. The board shoved him out. They tried to bring somebody in to run it. The board brought him back. And then when they finally brought in the guy who was up until 6 months ago, the current CEO, I thought he was the adult supervision.
Well, I do think that's been part of the issue. I wouldn't say in the annals of internet CEO founder kookiness, these guys have been pretty sane from the beginning, even though there have been, some core parts of them that actually is part of what makes Etsy so quirky and creative. That's been the issue. So I think you're right to question that part of it, but I don't think Etsy is very grassroots, and I think they have not killed. It's not like they cleaned house completely and did it again and did it again. I don't know what your feeling is. I know some people that have been amazing there and have been change agents at parts in the middle of it, and so I just feel like they should be innovating in some different ways because they can afford to.
I think some of it comes down to kind of a. At the end of the day, investors want exits. Yep. They don't invest in operations. They're not interested in paying your phone bill. So, quote unquote, patient capital may want to wait longer for an exit than, 3 years, and flip it. But when you say 7 years, I guess, if Etsy was running well, serving consumers, connecting craft creators with audiences, and remaining relatively flat or growing modestly, that might have been fine for everybody at the business or as a customer, but it wasn't fine for the investors.
Yeah, no, I agree. And by the way, I spoke of a kind of a narrative over time. Those 7 years are long since up. So the core original investors, it goes in phases. It's still demanding investors that want returns and exits. Now it's the funds that own the chunk of it because they bought it IPO or whatever, and consumers and individuals and banks and everyone else. it's the same dynamic and the demand. Uh, Look, if you wanted to look at it strategically a little, and I know we got to mix this amongst a bunch of other things, but this cuts into the next parts of this. A lot of these areas are converging, and the whole idea of a gig economy, which didn't exist, these job boards, and you can have 5 jobs and make money and be an influencer or whatever. In a way, the eBays and then the Etsy's of the world pioneered that before there was such a label. And so they're in conflict a little bit with a broader market for sort of independent retail money making than there used to be. But that being said, man, they shouldn't be messing it up. There's a careful way to manage this and also be creative. And I feel this is one of those ones that is less about tech and all this different strategy than staying sort of true and being open to just throwing some paint in the wall, So I don't know. Let's probably go to the other guys too.
so let's move to Meetup and WeWork.
Yes.
Big surprise. I mean, I know all kinds of people there. I know the founder. I've run meetups. Yep. I was involved in the New York Tech Meetup very, very early on.
Yeah.
I would have thought this would have made its way through my rumor mill to me. Came as a complete surprise. I was a little shocked.
And do you have because you and I both know Scott and have known him for a long time and I think admire him in the same ways and have had that guidance internally. Esther Dyson's been on their board. They've always been almost a non-commercial commercial entity, and aggressively and warmly and wonderfully that way. Does this feel like a sellout is the question, I think. Even aside from being surprised, because I sit there and think, okay, Scott, is this what he wants? Is this the right path? We're going to go talk about Tumblr in a second, and there's analogies because a lot of these things have to do with the spirit of the founder and where it goes. Not all companies, but this is a company that's like that.
So I have a lot of answers to that.
Yeah, I know, and it's a lot of questions.
I'll rattle them off.
Rattle them off.
As a person who ran a meetup for 6 years, locations were always the hardest part. You were always begging for rooms. You were always getting your meetup was always being. You had someone at one company that loved you, and then they moved on, and you had to find another location. And the meetup I ran was a big one. It was 3,000 members and 100 attendees, and so we needed a big room, and that was always a stress point that kept us. So the idea of Meetup being aligned with WeWork as a facilities partner, I think, is fabulous. Like that could be really, that makes good sense.
With limitations, because there's not enough capacity at WeWork for all the meetups that happen, right?
But Scott's not going anywhere. He's not leaving. That being said, when I read the New York Times article, it struck me, among other things, that WeWork is a little headless. Like, there wasn't a WeWork CEO who was quoted in the first 8 there was somebody mentioned at the bottom.
Yeah, totally right. So the question is, what is the synergy as they see it? It's not obvious in a there's one answer way, right? There's alignment in the sense that yes, WeWorks and meetups flood urban, suburban, and places where there's commercial activities. And they're unique that way, kind of, because they straddle digital, offline, online in a large way, right? Uber kind of thing. So, but what else? Meeting space. I thought I was keep going to your tick-offs though, because I think
so no money was listed,
right?
So it isn't clear to me whether it, as a founder and a guy who knows startup politics, I'm always strangely suspicious when there isn't a number.
Yeah. Well, and we know that from the beginning, Meetup not just rejected the idea of having marketing and advertising and pay for play and that kind of thing too much in these. But of course, because an immense ecosystem got built up that had a lot of businesses around it and behind it, there have been ways to create it. But it's one of these things where their revenue and their P&L may be like whatever the ecosystem's got stuff going around that they don't even necessarily touch.
Look,
So
Scott has said from the beginning, the purpose of Meetup is to get people off the internet. And it wasn't a marketing idea, it wasn't a cute phrase, it wasn't like, it was his core passion, which was to get people to be together. And you know, I believed it when he said it the first time, and I believe it 10 years later, and I think he's remained steadfast in that. And
yeah, I think the issue, like a lot of things that are digital businesses in some way, is that executing digitally to make that happen kind of is a fly in that ointment, in the sense that, you know, they must be a good technology company, and there must be enough presence and community and glue to what is online in order for that machine to hum optimally. And so, you know, is it a kind of a public trust? I think of that about Twitter a lot. You know, man, these things would better off if they were funded, but were just kind of nonprofits, or, you know, didn't have to grow or produce margins.
So two more. So let's jump to Kickstarter.
Yep.
Because Kickstarter is right in the weird, squishy middle of that conversation. You know, I mean, they're a public benefit corporation, so, you know, they have said, we're not about making money. We're not about IPOing. We're not looking to be the biggest. We want to be, you know, we want to be right. And they've had their, you know, there's been a turnover in the CEO. I was puzzled by how little press Kickstarter's new drip service got.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, they didn't do a good job at necessarily getting it out, but the question is, was there, you know, an audience waiting, or was it not even really picked up? And I think Kickstarter is an example of a company, an entity, a wonderful thing that's kind of a little bit imperiled, because they just have not particularly executed past the initial first 3 or 4 years in a way that makes them unique. But boy, to have such a dominant market, there's a broader question around crowdfunding, which felt like a giant inevitability and probably has still kept its growth, but hasn't like completely taken over the world, or, you know, and, you know, we don't want this. The theme of the discussion is the right one. There's an alternate when you talk about Kickstarter that might bring in AngelList and all these other guys that are Indiegogo that are in that world, because there's multiple types of that. But in the theme of today, it's a company that I just think is not particularly doing a good job at managing its adolescence.
I mean, clearly Drip was meant to, you know, I think the decision that was made internally, it seemed like, was, you know, Patreon is really working, and Drip is really kind of a copy of Patreon.
Yes. And they need that. I mean, so there, I do feel like do you think it's if it is a super success, is it just another thing that's working well for them, or can it help reinvent or bring about? I have this feeling that it's a little essential but peripheral.
So, all right. So here's the. I don't think I'm doing a good job of knitting together the thing that's gnawing at my gut, which is, in the case of both, you know, Etsy and Kickstarter, these were mission-driven companies that said, we want to do good, and we want to do well by doing good, but we don't want to do well at the cost of our, you know, we want to have a great work environment, we want to have a great experience, we want to have great customer experience, and now maybe it is, you know, their teenage years, their middle age, whatever, in dog years, whatever they are as startups, like, there's some outside pressure to actually keep getting bigger, keep being innovating, and you're saying you think Kickstarter is flat, which is interesting.
Yeah, I do, because I do think that it would be like me if I had the time to go run those numbers or do something around that, but I don't have, other than a gut sense of it. But, you know, they were a large fish in a small and fast-growing pond, and they are still by far the largest. They have a almost direct competitor now in Indiegogo, and the world has gotten bigger and more complex, and they're all over the world. So my question is, I think you're on the right point there, and I guess that's what's great that does knit these things together. My answer to your theme, part of that in a way, is that depending on the dynamics of the kind of business, some of this is out of their hands. It could be, I'm saying execution is the reason one is failing or succeeding, but the reality is it's hard to be so dominant in a market as fraught and chopped into verticals by definition as the space Kickstarter is in. So that has made it difficult. I have a different gripe, having gone through a very bad, failed for my own reason Kickstarter about 5 months ago, is I was on the inside of the guts of it, and I just think they haven't bothered to update the software. I mean, look, it's a publishing model that lets you put up a tent city for a certain amount of time, and it hums to the extent that you can do those things really well. We have consumer apps that now let us toggle back and forth between, different social networks with our dopey "what am I doing for lunch" kind of things. And that's slick, and it is pulling teeth to put up and manage, and it feels very WordPress 1998 to do that on Kickstarter. So that worried me a lot and made me feel like somebody's not best of breed updating this stuff the way it absolutely must happen. So, I don't know enough beyond that, but that biased me, and I should have started with that.
No. All right, which brings us to, I mean, in some ways, these all come down to personalities, right?
Yeah.
So Scott, solid, steady, staying with it, ready to grow to the next level. I'm hoping that I'll find out from inside that he's got a bunch more cash to work with and a bunch more resources. It seems like he does.
Yeah,
so that's all great.
Yep.
Unclear whether he got money out, whether the investors got money out. That'll come out at some point or another.
I will say, just as a footnote, and I know we need to kind of move things along, but you nailed something really good there. I think that it makes, I'd never thought of this. If WeWork is just buying the access and the intelligence and the network and the stuff to supercharge their location-based thing with a much more cohesive, robust, dynamic meetings kind of thing, that's pretty powerful, right? If they could sprinkle a little General Assembly on their whole world, if those of you that know, General Assembly is the inverse of what you said earlier. They have a kind of a face and a theory and a theme. They're not just a bunch of spaces. Anyway, go on.
So Tumblr. So David Karp is stepping down as the CEO.
Yep.
And he wrote this very heartfelt, clearly pained, like, I'm letting you down exit letter. Like he was really, like, troubled and spent months deciding what to do.
Yes.
And my reaction was like, dude, it's been 10 years. You did good. Like, I don't know why, like,
Well, he doesn't want to betray. Look, if you look, we know what the turning point in that was. It was when Yahoo acquired them. It was very much a personal, we know some of these people very well. It was very much a personal thing between Marissa Mayer and David, and it was definitively and overtly stated as if to say this is not going to be the same as other acquisitions, that that I'm going to be protected to make this a bigger, better, in the exact image of what it's always been kind of thing. Always of dubious premise. We all know how many things have disappeared completely without a trace inside of Yahoo, and then Marissa leaves. So whether it was proceeding or not, whether it had inevitable flaws or issues, I think that his patron and his protection was gone, and I just can't imagine. It's hard to say whether he was naive in the first place, exhausted, as you say, and 10 years. He also always had a great, I'm going to not touch my digital stuff for the rest of the day kind of attitude about things. And so that company has always been handcrafted. But people in America don't realize how global and immense and still powerful and commercially viable Tumblr is.
Tell me more about that, because I'm not sure I realize that.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, so
Yeah,
I
no,
don't.
I don't mean the numbers,
I looked
but
about
just
a
like,
year
I guess
ago.
I don't hear Tumblr come up in the who's killing it conversation a lot.
No, well, you're right. First of all, there's a tech coverage thing where if something isn't new,
Yep.
uh, when does anybody written anything meaningful about Yelp lately, right? It almost as if it doesn't exist anymore, and yet it's just kind of in place as a reasonably, I don't know how profitable or growing it is, but it's like it hasn't disappeared. And I think there's a thing of that in coverage. And then there's I don't think that one of the reasons why this era is not the IPO era that .com one was it didn't make sense to be a lot of IPOs, which also have to do with a lot of acquisitions and mergers and a lot of corporate, we don't know what the answer is to what the futures and outcomes of some of these companies are going to be. And there certainly is not a lot of examples. In a way, Yahoo's acquisition, consistent with Yahoo's strategy in the second half of its life, is of a kind of a different but still a media company, content company. We own assets, we cover categories, we do whatever. And I think that if to end users that model makes sense, right? I can go to Yahoo Sports or Tumblr or whatever. From a business point of view, they don't sit there as assets the way companies, ironically, like Time Inc. used to gobble up magazines and sit there and have properties coexisting together and having a corporate reason that makes sense. What the hell is the point of Tumblr inside Yahoo? No idea. That being said, there's a very, very large number of people who still use it. They're both competing with the blogging world and the social media world and the Squarespace and people that need to put up their, about us part of their website. So I'm kind of running on, but I do feel like it's.
Well, the biggest surprise to me in the Recode article was Tumblr saying that the current COO would be the interim CEO while they searched for a new one. Right. And I thought, wait, your Tumblr inside Huffington Post, inside Oath, inside Verizon, like, is there really a CEO? I mean, isn't it just a division or a brand or a platform?
Oh, that's a good question. I think CEO, I think the only hope for it is for it to effectively run as an independent company inside of, or at least a contained entity inside of whatever its parent is. So it does need, I don't know that it needs any more vision than it ever had, but it still needs the stewardship and almost to represent, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Is there I don't think there really is much of a future if they're not going to strongly still maintain some of what David's vision always has been, which is still breathtaking on simplicity and front end compared to the alternatives to do these things. You and I have had this discussion about our own website in terms of, Squarespace, Tumblr, whatever.
I wonder if Medium stepped into that breach a little bit.
Well, that's a really good point. Medium's a really good one to take up in the future because, again, and this is Ev Williams' thing in a way, to be so world-changing with something that still may not have standalone business viability in a way that we understand, and the new model is going to be, they're going to come along and Medium has chunked off parts of different things, and they kind of own now. Anyone we know who's a writer thinks if I'm going to live and breathe and do this, Medium is a place that's very writerly centric. But of course, adding rich media and making that more 3D, by 3D I mean dynamic in terms of everything it's about, is essential. Otherwise, it's competing with like Tom Hanks' typewriter app instead of a social network or a platform. It is an interesting combination, but what would it? They could be really interesting together if it helped them find a business world, in which to exist. It's Tumblr is a really, really tough one. Such an innovator, but I don't know.
By the way, 10 years might be the natural life of these things. By the way, we are officially out of time.
It could be. Yeah. Well, I like the way that we did this because we did cover different topics, but a little room to breathe inside of them.
and I will post the links, and then we will return again next week.
All right, Steve. Thanks. Talk to you soon, man.
See you.